see that checklist at the moment?
Yep.
Okay, so one of the things I've done is I'm going to be uploading this after our check, but I thought, hey, what's something? So one of the things I've done is put forward this checklist for you to maybe have a look at as you're getting your assignment ready. Again, it's not going to go into the great detail to tell you exactly what you've got right or wrong. You probably want to have a look at your CRA to make sure that you're addressing the key elements of what you're trying to do. Look back in the slides as the process that you need to go through, or the key elements of an analysis, to make sure you've got that right. But if you look at the content of what you should have, like when you've finished your assignment, you should be clear on what the ethical problem is. So I think like, for instance, the 6 scenarios we put up are scenarios, but one of your first steps is to make sure you're clear about what that problem, what that ethical problem is. What's the thing that someone is in danger of doing wrong? Okay, think about it that way. That's what you want to isolate and talk about. So a lot of people have been asking about how much detail do I put in, etc. Well, as much detail as you need to be able to address the first criteria. And it's asking you to be clear on why it's an ethical issue, and then why it's an ethical dilemma. Okay, so it's about making sure that the first part of your assignment clearly addresses that. Obviously, you're going to have to discuss some facts as part of that, but it wouldn't be like a wholesale description of the scenario. It's concentrating in on the essential elements that make it an ethical dilemma and being clear about what that dilemma is. What's the situation or the problem that you're trying to resolve? Why is it an ethical problem, and why is it a dilemma? Okay, so that's what the first bit. Make sure you've got an ethical problem, make sure it's a dilemma. Now, the next thing is to make sure that you have 3 frameworks. Okay, if you don't have 3 frameworks, you can't meet those 3 criteria. So you definitively need 3 frameworks. Remember that those 3 frameworks should come from 2 different weeks. Okay, so one of the things for you to think about, why are we asking that? To make your life difficult? No. It's to have you focus and see that you can approach ethics from different angles. So in week 2, we discuss ethical acts, and in week 3, we discuss things as from the actor perspective. So it's really making sure that you can address the problem from different angles. I think the best approach is to take some from week 2 and 3. I think week 4 will be difficult because it's approaching things at a system level. Okay, so clearly weeks 2 and 3. Now, which frameworks? Well, within each framework, make sure it's normative. Okay, if you use a descriptive framework, it's going to be difficult to come to a clear conclusion if you're using the framework well. Okay, so across those 2 weeks, there is one descriptive framework we use. Now, it's Kohlberg, right? But Kohlberg is used normatively, so you can use it normatively, but it's difficult to use it normatively. Why? If you think about Kohlberg, right, the problem is Kohlberg doesn't help you decide what to do. It doesn't tell you to do or not do something. What it actually helps you do is analyze. If someone does something, you look at why they did it, and then you can classify them on the network, on the framework. So when you look at a descriptive theory like that, it's more difficult for you to do well when you're trying to answer a question of what you should do, not why you did it and what the reason for doing something. See, Kohlberg looks at your motivation and then says, how morally developed are you based upon that motivation? Okay, that's what it's doing. So how that helps you answer a normative question is difficult. Where it's used normatively is where people say, oh, you should be higher on this rather than lower. So yes, that's a normative use of the framework, but that normative use of it doesn't help you actually answer an ethical dilemma, I don't think, in any great detail. So using a descriptive theory, I think, can be quite difficult. Okay. So make sure you use a normative framework. Make sure it's focused on the correct level. So again, think about week 4 is at a systemic level versus, what's going on in terms of an individual act or decision is more weeks 2 and 3. So I think that should guide you about what kinds of frameworks you want to use. The third dot point we've got there is clearly identify the ethical behaviour determined by the framework. So after you've finished applying the framework, make sure you say, does the framework say it's ethical or not? What's the ethical thing to do under the framework? You've got to draw that conclusion from the framework. Otherwise, you haven't done a good analysis. Make sure you go back and understand the steps you've got to follow to do a framework, to apply a framework. So that should be in the slides. Make sure you follow all those steps and draw that conclusion, whether it's ethical or not. Okay. With that, identify how an ethical behaviour is determined. Be very clear what the decision rule is. Okay, so each framework you determine what is ethical based upon a decision rule about. This is what the framework says. You determine ethical behaviour by this. So you want to clearly communicate that to the marker. You want to clearly communicate the steps you've got to go through to apply the framework and do that. And then you've got to determine whether the act is ethical or not. Once you've done all that through the frameworks, you want to make sure you have a clear recommendation. What do you think should happen? And that recommendation needs to be justified. By justified, it's saying what reasons do you have for making the recommendation? A shallower reason is 2 frameworks said to do it and 1 said not, right? That's a shallow justification. That's, to get a depth behind that justification, what you want to do is talk about the good, if there's a framework that agrees with your recommendation, that probably says, well, I think about this problem the way that framework says. So what are the strengths of that framework? Okay, so, well, because that's kind of why you want to use it probably. Also, you're probably going to be going against 1 or 2 of the other frameworks. So why didn't you like their answers? Right? So that's probably got to do with the weaknesses of those frameworks or the criticisms of those frameworks. So I think if you look at the strengths and weaknesses of each of the frameworks we use, that should provide some good solid reasons for your justification. Okay, so really that's trying to step you through and say, what are the core things that you're trying to do? You've got to make sure you've got an ethical dilemma. You've got to make sure you've got 3 frameworks from 2 weeks. You've got to be clear on what the framework is. You've got to apply it. You've got to draw a conclusion. Then you've got to have an overall recommendation that's justified, probably based upon the strengths and weaknesses of the frameworks. As well as that content, make sure you go through, the basic hygiene of good writing. There are quite a few marks here for communication. So review the structure. Does it make sense? Is it easy for the reader, for the examiner to actually read what you've got there? Have you done a spell and grammar check? Have you read it aloud? Reading aloud is one of the best ways that you can check that it sounds good and that it makes sense. Just check that your referencing approach, etc., is correct. People have asked me about referencing, right? This isn't a research piece. So there's no expectation about the number of references, etc. What we're asking is that you follow the QUT plagiarism and academic writing guidelines, which are if you quote someone, yes, you need to cite it and have the page number. If a major idea comes from a reading or from the lectures that you cite where that major idea comes from, this idea that you're using, that's just good academic writing. Outside of that, it should be a lot of your own work. So there probably isn't going to be a lot of citation in the actual assignment. Okay, so I tried to kick us off a little bit with some ideas around an assignment checklist. Were there any kind of specific questions that people had coming through at the moment? Yep, what's the question, Jack? Sorry, I'm having trouble seeing it. So can you tell me what it is?
What type of formatting is appropriate? Should there be headings?
Look, I think heading, should there be headings? Look, that's largely up to you. I think headings help the reader follow the argument. So if it were me writing it, I would have major headings for the major elements of the piece. But again, we don't have a marking guide saying you get marks for headings, etc. If it makes it easier to follow, yes. Is that part of generally how good business writing occurs? I would say yes, there are headings. I wouldn't go overboard. It's only 1,200 words, so you don't need a real lot of headings. But I think they can help steer the reader and help you understand the piece a lot better.
Okay, another question from the CRA. We should explain why the situation is of ethical concern, demonstrate the insightful understanding of how conflicting principles or values contribute to a challenging ethical dilemma, and identify and explain nuances such as making ethical choices can involve a trade-off between ethical standards, etc. I'm not sure that I put more information on this part. Oops, just trying to...
So I'm not sure what the nature of the question is about that. So what that's really trying to do is those dot points about why is it an ethical problem? Okay, so you're going to have to go back into what makes something ethical, right? What makes something ethical, and think back into the first lecture. And then why is it a dilemma? Well, the nuance in the dilemma is probably going to involve the idea that from different perspectives, it's not clear what the right thing to do is. Okay, so that's one of the reasons why I've said, and I've been clear all along, that if you have different frameworks giving you different answers, it's probably a dilemma, because ethically, from one ethical perspective, the answer is the opposite from what another ethical perspective says. That's why it's a dilemma, right? So what you have is the conflicting values or the conflicting ethical views or the conflicting, that's what's causing the dilemma. So explaining what, by the nature of this problem, that it's a dilemma because why? Well, why is it a dilemma? Why is it hard to decide? Because if all your frameworks say the ethical thing to do is X, then you don't really have a dilemma. It's easy, right? You just do X if you want to be ethical. So if you're at all, and the whole idea here is that frameworks are much better at helping us think through when we have a problem where we're not sure what the ethical thing to do actually is. Yeah. So that's what that CRA is getting to. I'm not sure whether I answered the question, but it means that explanation of the dilemma should concentrate on why it's an ethical dilemma. Why is it about ethics? And then why is it a dilemma? Okay, if you do those two things, I think you'll do pretty well against that criteria.
Okay, I think the question was about putting the dilemma describing the dilemma in your own words in the beginning and then in the analysis. But the dilemma would be very much like what's in the examples on Blackboard.
Yeah, well, I would just concentrate on the bits of the scenario. So if we call those examples that we put up, those 6 examples, the scenario, I would be saying that those scenarios, you don't need to repeat what the scenario is. You need to repeat the parts of the scenario that are relevant to why it's ethical and why it's a dilemma. So it's kind of like extracting what's relevant to concentrate on saying, there's an ethical dilemma because, why? Why are you saying it's an ethical dilemma? You will be using some of the detail in the scenario to do that. So I think you'll need to use enough detail that the examiner can understand what's going on. But then you can have your scenario in the appendix. And if it's been your own scenario that you've developed, I'd be writing a short summary of that scenario, you know, a couple of paragraphs, like what we've done with the 6 scenarios. And I'd be appendicizing that so that the examiner can go to it if they're unsure what you're talking about. And then you just need to extract what you need to do that to explain why it's an ethical dilemma. But I think you can explain what the problem is at the same time as you concentrate on the ethics of it and the dilemma of it on those 2 dimensions.
Okay, another question in relation to the utilitarian framework. So when analysing issue from a utilitarian perspective, do you address all the possible pains and pleasures produced from each decision? Because this has made my word count very high.
Okay, so I won't be a sec. I just want to shut my door. Getting a bit of an echo. Okay, so I think the examiners are being briefed that we've got to be reasonable about this, right? So I think what you have to do is to do enough to demonstrate that you know how the framework works and what the problems with the framework are. So what you're clearly isolating is a problem with utilitarianism, right? When do you stop? How do you make these calculations? So I think you need to have a reasonable number of stakeholders. What's reasonable? Well, it's got to be several, right? That's how I would say it. Several the most important. Now, why am I saying several and not 2 or 3 or something, right? Well, because it depends on the scenario. So if the scenario names a stakeholder that is affected, you know, I would think deeply before I didn't include that stakeholder because it's very clearly identified. Now, at some point, you can think up all these other stakeholders. So I would be at least thinking up one stakeholder, not in the scenario, if it's appropriate. Why? Because it shows that you know it's more than just the named people. Okay. So then you go, okay, where do I stop? Well, you know, I think once you've demonstrated, you know, the idea of fecundity, etc., or the extent of the challenge, you can maybe put a little note if you're worried in brackets. You know, I've assumed that this is the limit of the stakeholders, or you know, I've ended here for parsimony or something like that to demonstrate that you know it goes further, but you're going to stop here. Because I think it's about demonstrating you know how the framework works. So I think you need to get the key stakeholders. I think most of the key stakeholders should be able to come from your scenario. I don't think there's an absolute number that you can give. I can tell you that if you only had 1, you wouldn't have enough, right? So that's clear. And I understand the problem about word count when you start getting lots and lots and lots. Think about the use, if you have that many that it's really blowing your word count, think about the judicious use of tables and appendices, which, you know, tables and appendices are real world business formatting approaches that people use to contain and summarize detail. Okay, so this is a replication of what does happen in the real world. What you want to make sure is that your core logic and explanation is contained in the narrative, that the tables are extensions of that, are the example and detail of that, okay? And that the appendix is about detail, right? Rather than the core narrative. Because no one, when you're writing a business report, you do not want the core narrative to be right at the back where no one will see it. Okay, so that's the essence. That would be my key advice around that particular issue.
Okay, another question about the ethical dilemma. So would you recommend explaining why it is an ethical dilemma in the initial introduction, then continuing and going into the 3 frameworks and then drawing a conclusion at the end?
I think you can approach it any way you want, but having said that, I think that that would probably make it pretty easy for the marker to read and understand. And when you're doing business writing, the core thing you want to do is communicate with your readership, right? You want to communicate with them in the most effective, efficient way. You know, in many ways, what we're doing here is very similar to the real world, right? People, senior managers get lots of reports they have to read. And if they can't read and understand it quickly, right, they'll toss it out or send it back, all right? So what we're doing here is it does actually really replicate the real world. So I would say structuring it in a way that helps the person, the reader, do the task that they have to do is a very smart way to do it. And I think that structure you have outlined seems to follow the CRA, which is the task of the reader in this instance. So to me, that would be a smart way to structure it. You don't have to do it that way. Seems like a smart way that would clearly identify, you know, and make the task of the person reading it easy to do.
Okay, so we've got a question about Kantian ethics.
Yes.
Should I apply both formulations, which are universal acceptability and respect in this case, or do I only need to use one formulation?
Okay, so in applying the categorical imperative, we're using two of the three tests, which is universality and respect. And within universality, I imagine that you're thinking about contradiction in conception and contradiction in will. So I believe you are demonstrating more knowledge by applying more of the framework. Okay, so I would suggest that I know that the rule is if you breach one of them, and you need to clearly communicate that, you know, if you breach one of these formulations, then it's not ethical. So you don't need to do any more, and you clearly don't need to do any more than one to get a pass and a bit beyond, and even beyond a pass. The question becomes, how do you demonstrate that depth of knowledge and nuance? I think that's easier done by going beyond just the simple first one that it breaches. So the answer is I still think you do quite well with one. However, I think you can show added nuance and depth of knowledge by using the full formulation. Again, maybe a little bit of the answer to this is guided by word count, etc. I don't know how many words you've got to play with in the Kantian area based upon your assessment. So it's part of the problem of writing a complex piece, right? You've got to balance these things. But there are other ways around that. If it was word count, you might appendicize the other, you know, elements and just concentrate on the one, showing the other one in an appendix. So there's multiple ways you could get around that problem if word count is driving that question.
Okay, a question on sources. Can you give me some reputable sources and how many reference should we use?
Okay, a reputable source is chili sauce. It's my favorite because it's nice and hot and I like no sauces. Okay. So I think you don't need terribly many citations aside from the readings. I would tend not to in an academic work use Wikipedia, etc. Right? I think practically going to Wikipedia to get an idea of something is a realistic, practical way of understanding something. Then you've got to think, well, okay, well, is Wikipedia right? Well, what are some of the original sources behind Wikipedia, etc. So if I were doing research, yeah, I mean, I go to the web and look at some stuff. And then if you think you're getting a sense of what the issue is, but then you want to check, okay, well, what is a source for that? For me, sources like, you know, textbooks, edited books, academic journals, their peer-reviewed journals, they tend to be more reputable sources than other sources. So that's what I would be looking at in terms of citation. But I think, you know, we've hopefully given you enough in the readings because this isn't a research project. So, you know, all you really want are the core ideas behind these theories. So I actually also think that things like, you know, you get a lot of it from the lecture slides and from the readings. I kind of wonder if that mightn't be enough sources. We don't have a CRA that looks for the level of research, right? So just bear that in mind. Is that a decent enough answer, Jackie, you think?
I think so. There's no more questions. Okay, I've got another one.
Yep.
Do we capitalise the approach's name? Ethical egoism in uppercase for ethical and egoism, or ethical egoism lowercase?
Oh my God. What do you reckon, Jackie?
I think lowercase is fine.
Yeah. Here's the key. Be consistent. Yeah. Really, it's not so much. You can, because, okay, so let's look at capitalisation. When do we capitalise? We capitalise when something is a proper noun. So strictly speaking, I think you could capitalise. I'm not sure a marker is going to be marking down any marks if you don't capitalise. What they will mark down for is if you are inconsistent. So you capitalise sometimes and don't capitalise other times. One of the difficult things is if you capitalise, you need to be clear that you only use the capital when you're using it as a proper noun. Okay, so for instance, this is, for everyone else, just tune out because this is going to be confusing. So if you were writing a sentence, a utilitarian approach is blah, 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 then utilitarian is not capitalised, right? But if you were writing the utilitarian framework, because you're talking about a very specific framework, then that would be capitalised. So if you're going to capitalise, you have to be careful about when you use it, because it should only be used when it's a proper noun. That's the technical. The practical one, I think I would go with Jackie. If in doubt, don't capitalise. That way you don't have to have that dilemma. Of course, you might want to capitalise, you know, your headings, but in the general text.
Okay, so we've got another question. If we're running out of room, can we list some of the points? For example, when mentioning Bentham's methods of determining happiness, can we just list them all but go into detail for only a couple?
I mean, that sounds reasonable to me. Go into, and the question is, you know, why? Be careful. One of the things that's causing me to pause is you got to be smart about how you write. So one way to write is you can write a definition, then you can do your application. Okay, now that takes a lot more words. Or you can write the definition as you do the application. Now, if you do that, it has a lot fewer words, and it's also probably clearer to the reader that you know what you're doing. So one of the things that's causing me to pause about the question is it sounds like, you know, you're doing a definitional element. So that's what, it's not wrong. It's not wrong at all. It just says they have a look at the way you've approached that, because there could be a smarter way of doing it. I don't have a problem at all about it, and I don't even have a problem as if you want to appendicize that detail in some way and say, you know, determining happiness under the hedonic calculus is difficult and contains many factors. See Appendix 1, right? In this case, I'll blah, 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 and then concentrate on some. Because what you're doing is you're putting the detail of what's behind it away, but you still, in your body, you have the core argument, which is I'm concentrating on these to do my calculation because they're the most important, right? So that's, hopefully that answers it. Does that answer it, Jackie, do you think?
I think so. So.
Yeah.
We've got another question on recommendations. Should we write recommendations for each framework, or just put them in the last conclusion part?
I think you're being asked for one recommendation. What should you do? So that's how I would answer that. I'm cautious because for some people English is a second language. So sometimes this kind of discussion cannot be as clear as what it could be for everyone. Each framework should come up with a clear conclusion about what the framework says is ethical or not. Okay, so each framework should have a clear, is it ethical or is it not, based upon this framework. But then at the end of that, you have to come up with a recommendation about whether you should do it or not. So that's how I would answer that question.
Okay, another question. I'm doing number 6, one of the provided issues. Should I provide a real life example?
You'll be fine just using that. That is based on a real life example. So I mean, if you wanted to, e.g. one line, great. But I don't see that as a major thing.
Okay, another question on framework use. Do we recommend a framework to use or which action to take? So, for example, he should X, as Kant says it's ethical, and virtue ethics says he will be ethical for doing it.
So I think that kind of answer. So I really like, okay, what do I really like about that? He or she should do X. Okay, so there's a clear recommendation. I'm not sure that the justification has the depth that it could. I think a better justification is, why do you think utilitarianism is good? Or why do you think virtue ethics is good? And why do you think Kant is bad? Or, that's it. And they will probably be based upon the strengths and weaknesses of the frameworks. Having said that, the purpose of this section is to also provide you a chance for you to think about how you think about ethics. So we're not sitting there with an answer key that says issue 6 needs to be answered this way, right? We're not doing that at all. We're saying we believe it's a dilemma. So we're happy with the answer yes or no. Okay, so we're happy with either yes or no. Having said that, this is a chance for you to think about, well, how do I think about things? Which frameworks do I like? And the frameworks you like, or the frameworks you believe are more ethical, the frameworks that you think give you an answer in this situation, that's why you'll choose that action, right? And so that will then help you think about, well, is it really, I really like utilitarianism because it's about helping the most people, right? And that's why I like it, and that's why I like the outcome from it here. Well, if that's it, that's your reason, right? That's your justification. And you probably don't like Kant because it's too strict or something like that, right? So it's about using the strengths and weaknesses to provide, I think, that good justification. Does that kind of answer it, you think, Jackie?
Yeah, I reckon so. Okay. Another question. In the introduction, do we mention how an ethical dilemma differs from etiquette or law?
Oh, they're going to be totally unsatisfied with my answer to this. Look, you've got to be thoughtful. If it helps you explain why it's an ethical dilemma, yes. If it doesn't help you explain why it's an ethical dilemma, then no. So I think you want to cover the core about what an ethical dilemma is. Maybe if you have enough words explaining why it's not something else could be useful.
Okay. Should we talk about the strengths and weaknesses of each framework when we define it, or only in the recommendations?
That's up to you. I think it can be done both ways. Again, be thoughtful about how much time you spend in what you've got to be careful of is that you're just not listing information that is really just repeating what's in the readings or slides, right? I mean, you need to do a little bit of that, not repeating, not quoting, but even repeating the ideas, right? You got to do a little bit of that, I understand, but the more you do of that, the more words it's going to suck up and the less value you're adding. because the value you're adding is by doing the application rather than telling us what you're going to do. So listing the strengths and weaknesses adds less value than demonstrating how a strength helps you make a recommendation, or how a so, you know, by using it that way, you're doing it in an application. You definitely could list them, right? And you definitely could list them after each framework and then reference that back in. And there are advantages and disadvantages of doing it both ways. But I'd be careful about listing and defining. And, you know, it sounds like we're using quite a few words to essentially regurgitate information rather than show that we're thinking about it and processing it.
Okay, so another question is, what type of information should we include that best shows our knowledge of the frameworks? And where could we put in the disadvantages of the frameworks? I assume 1 to 2 sentences at the end of the framework.
Yeah, you could definitely do it that way. You know, if it's not coming up anywhere else, you know, like, and I think 1 to 2 sentences is fine, you know, because you can finish and says, you know, utilitarianism says it's ethical, blah, blah, blah. While it says that, some disadvantages of the approach are this, this, and this, which is clear in my analysis or something. So you can definitely do that. If you've got enough words, yep, that would be great. The other thing is to think about, as I've said, I think a few times now, think about how whether they're worth including in the justification for your recommendation, either positively or negatively. But again, I understand you might need to put a little bit of both in both sections of the document. Did I answer everything in that question, Jackie?
I think so.
Yeah.
Yep.
I'm just sorry, I just can't see the question. Sorry.
Yeah,
so
no.
I don't know why. I've done something to my computer.
It talks about what type of information should we include that best shows our knowledge of the framework. So maybe you haven't covered that part.
Well, hopefully, so when I went through the checklist, that's what I'm trying to outline in the checklist, yeah? So let me go back to that checklist, yeah? Each framework, okay, so clearly identifies the decision, right? This clearly identifies how the ethical behaviour is determined by the framework. What's the decision rule, right? You need to be clear that you understand what the decision rule is. Under the framework. That is a key piece of knowledge. Whatever the process the framework uses, you need to make sure you follow that process. And we have a number of slides on that are very clear about that. Some of them even state what the process is. So that shows you know what the essential elements of the framework are. And then you've actually got to come to a decision, a conclusion about what the framework says. And that will be, can you actually apply this process and this decision rule? Okay, and if you do those things, you will have covered off the key elements of the framework. Do you think that's clear enough, Jackie?
Yep.
Okay.
I think so. Yep. Another question. I was just wondering, if we are using one of the given ethical issues, do we need to rewrite it, or can we just include it as an appendix?
Yeah.
This person's emailed, so don't worry about that email when you get it.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, very clearly you can use, you can appendicize the scenario. As I think I've said a couple of times, one of the things you're going to have to do, though, is you might have to use some of the facts from it when you're explaining why it's an ethical dilemma. So I would imagine that you're going to use some of the scenario in the body, but yeah, you can definitely, you don't need to copy and paste 2 paragraphs in.
Okay. So when referencing an article from a journal that is not a direct quote under APA, do we include the page numbers in the in-text reference?
Oh my God, yes, fantastic question. No, look, I love that you're going into this detail. For us, no. The short answer, no. Where that advice is coming from is it often varies by journal and publisher. So some say yes, some say no. I'm going to say, let's make it easy. Let's save some words for everyone. No. unless you have a direct quote. If it's a direct quote in quotation marks, you need the page number.
Okay. Is it necessary to write at the end of each framework a moral act if the result of the theory is immoral?
No. Well, you need to work out what you need to be clear about what the ethical or unethical thing to do is. I don't know. No, I'm not really sure. I don't know if I understand what that question's asking.
I've asked for it to be rephrased, but I haven't got that through yet.
Yeah,
I think what they're saying is if decided that at the end of each framework, a moral act, if it's immoral, do you then have to say what should be done? So if I say, okay, at the end of the day, this act is immoral, do I then present an alternative?
Then presumably the moral act is not to do it, and it's implied. So that would be pretty clear to me, but I'm a bit cautious because I'm not sure I understand that question totally. But based upon what I think the question is saying, I think if you are clear about what is unethical, you're also clear about what is ethical. So, because it would be the opposite of what is being proposed.
Okay, there's no more. Okay, I don't think there's any more questions.
Well, that's good because I think we're near the end of our time.
Yep. So Rainey's all good with that, so that's fine. Yep.
That all okay?
Yep.
Okay, guys, best of luck. I'll upload that assignment checklist within the next hour or so, I hope, so that everyone's got a copy of that. But good luck. It's good to see you all working hard.
All right, excellent. I'll end it all.
Thanks very much.